Hello everyone and welcome to Wayfair Coding Academy's How to Linux series, where the goal of this series is to cover all things Linux, from the basics like standard installations and learning how to use your system, to more advanced topics such as advanced installations, customizing your system, and learning how to use various programs available on Linux. As one of the first 3 videos of this series, the goal is to demonstrate one of 3 different setups for installing a Linux operating system. This is because while distros may differ between each other with their specific install processes, the processes themselves are usually the same across the different setups. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to install a distro on a virtual machine. Virtual machines are good for when you don't want to completely replace your current operating system with Linux, especially if you're still just experimenting with it or you just don't have the money to buy extra hardware. The downside is that you will be limited to the amount of RAM, processing, and storage that you can use because it's being used within the host operating system. The virtual machine also won't be able to directly use the graphics card, and instead will have to rely on virtual graphic drivers. There are different types of virtual machines, and the type that we are going to focus on is a Type 2 virtual machine, which means that it runs within the host operating system, as opposed to a Type 1, which runs directly on the hardware. In order to run virtual machines, we will need something called a hypervisor. For Type 2, the hypervisor will be a piece of software that needs to be installed. There are 2 hypervisor softwares that we can use on both Windows and Mac OS, VMware or VirtualBox. I personally prefer VirtualBox because it is completely free and open source, so that's what will be used in this video. To get VirtualBox, head over to virtualbox.org and then click on the Downloads tab over here. Then select the installation file for your host. For me, it will be Windows. Once the download finishes, run the installer. It's a pretty quick and easy setup. First, it will ask if you want to customize anything here. By default, you really don't need to. It will provide everything you need to run virtual machines. So just click Next. Now it does give you a warning about network interfaces, and this is only because it has to create a new network interface for your virtual machines. This is how your virtual machines will be able to access the internet. So it's nothing serious to worry about, it's totally normal. VMware does it too. So just click yes to get the installation started. I already have it installed, so I'm not going to run the installer again. As for the distro, I will be using Fedora, because as mentioned earlier, the goal of this video is to focus on the install setup itself and not the install process of the distro. So I'm choosing a distro that should be relatively easy to install, but still includes one of the most common steps of the installation process that will be important in these videos. So I'm choosing a distro that should be relatively easy to install. Plus, Fedora is my preferred distro, and it's what I use for a lot of my videos that doesn't require anything that's distro specific. With that said, if you're already pretty familiar with Linux and you're just trying to learn how to use a virtual machine, then you're free to pick whatever distro you want to use. The virtual machine setup is still relatively the same. But for those of you who want to follow along and try out Fedora too, go to fedoraproject.org, and then up here, go to Get Fedora, and then click on Workstation. Then we click on the download link right here, and we're taken to the download page that will list all of the files and links that we can access to download an ISO image. Pretty much all distros will put their main ISO download at the very top, front and center, which would be technically these files right here, where we can see our Fedora Workstation 40, and you notice it says it's a live ISO. That means when we boot into this media, we're going to actually be able to preview the operating system before we actually install it. So go ahead and click on this button to download the file. And while that's downloading, I'll take a moment to show you some of the alternative download options that you have here. So if we scroll down and click on other downloads, all distro websites have an alternative page, and it usually just has a bunch of different alternative files or alternative methods to actually download the files. For Fedora, one of the first things we have is a network installer. The network installer is basically a bare minimum ISO, allowing it to be only 700 megabytes, and anything that it needs to install for the operating system will be downloaded from the internet as it runs the installer. This is perfect for when you don't want to have to deal with large files to download, or if you just don't have media large enough to handle the bigger files. If you're a fan of torrenting, most Linux distros have the ability to provide torrent downloads for you. On top of that, they also provide ISOs for alternative architectures. If we go to this link here, we have ARM64 architecture, we have Power architecture, and we have S390X architecture. Fedora also offers cloud-based images, testing images, and rawhide images. Rawhide is basically the beta test for future stable versions of Fedora. So in this case, Rawhide is likely going to be for Fedora Workstation 41. Now there is one last thing we need to do before we can create our virtual machine. Depending on how your system is set up, by default, VirtualBox will only allow you to create 32-bit virtual machines. If you want to create 64-bit virtual machines, then you need to go into BIOS and change the setting. What this setting is called depends on what kind of processor you have. If you have an Intel processor, then it's going to be virtualization technology. For AMD, the setting will be called AMD Virtualization, or AMD-V for short. Both of these settings can be found in the Advanced tab menu in BIOS. Once you enable those and restart your computer, you will be able to create 64-bit virtual machines. Alright, now that we have the VirtualBox software installed and we have our ISO file downloaded, let's go ahead and start building our VM. So on VirtualBox, as you can see here, the general layout is that on one side we have the list of all our VMs, and then on the other side it will provide information for a VM that we select. As you can see, I already have one. This VM is actually the one that I've been using to make all of my other videos, particularly my coding videos. So to create a new VM, we go up here to where this blue button is and click that. The first thing we need to do is name our VM. I'm going to call it Tutorial VM. The folder is the location that our VM will be stored in. It will default to a folder location that is set in our preferences under File. You can change the default up in File Preferences if you like, or if you just want to change it for this VM, you can go to Other and set a new folder. I'm going to leave it as this, and then I'm going to go down to our ISO image. Now, as you can see, I got a few ISO images right here. For you, you will most likely only see Not Selected and Other. So click on Other. It will open up a window here, and then just navigate to where you saved your ISO image and select it. And as you can see here, if it can, it will automatically fill in the type and version for your ISO. If it happens to get it wrong, you can go to each of these drop downs and change it to the appropriate one. So this is obviously Linux, and then down here, as you can see, we've got a lot of the major, more common Linux distros. We got Debian, Arch Linux, Fedora, OpenSUSE, and so on. If you are installing a Linux distro that's not in here, then you would go down to where it says Other Linux and choose the correct bit. But for us, we're choosing Fedora 64-bit, so I'm going to select that. Unattended install, I don't really see this ever activate that often, and even when it does, I've never really used it. So we'll leave that one alone. Hardware. This is the virtual hardware that we can give our VM, memory and processors. So for memory, I'm going to set it to 8192 megabytes, that's 8 gigabytes. And then for processors, I'm going to set it to 6. I'm not going to, well, I'll give it all 8. Then we go to hard disk. Now the number you see here is the minimal recommended that VirtualBox will give you. However, the number it gives you is often a tad too small in my opinion, even to just experiment with a temporary VM. Especially for Fedora, I don't think 15 gigabytes is really a lot to really do anything with it. So if you just need a temporary VM to experiment around with and everything, I would say at a minimum 50 gigabytes. I think that's plenty. If you're looking for something more permanent, long-term, and you're going to be doing some big stuff with it, then at a minimum, I would recommend 100 gigabytes. You can definitely give it more, especially if you have the space to do so, but at a minimum, I would definitely just say 100 gigabytes. Now down here, we select our file type for our virtual hard disk. I usually just leave it at VDI. Sometimes I will use VHD if it's necessary, but I usually just default to this. I'll check pre-allocate. What this does is that when we create the virtual hard disk, it's going to set it to the full size that we set here. If we didn't check it, it would set it to some small amount. And as time goes on, as we add more data to it and install stuff to it, that virtual hard disk would slowly grow to the specified amount. But if you just want to set it all at once and just have it be at that size, then just do what I do and check this box. Once you have all that set up, click Finish, and it will set up our virtual machine so that we can run the install. When our VM is finished being created, if we look down here in storage, we'll see that we have a virtual optical drive and that our ISO that we've downloaded is loaded into that optical drive. So when we start our VM up for the first time, this is what we're going to boot into. So we'll go ahead and click Start up here, and then eventually this window will appear. Let me resize it first. There we go. And then this window will appear, and then we click inside the window so we can gain control of this VM. So what we see right here is the grub boot menu. Grub is what we use for a boot menu when we have Linux operating systems installed. Unlike a normal boot menu like with Windows or Mac OS, the grub menu will always appear when we start up our machine. This is particularly useful if you're dual booting systems and you want to be able to select which operating system you want to boot into. This particular boot menu is just meant for the install media, so the only options we have is to start the live session or to test the media or to troubleshoot. So we're going to pick the Start Fedora Workstation Live. And whether you're installing a media for the first time or you're just starting up a virtual machine, it's completely normal for the window to resize itself a couple of times. So I'm just going to maximize it here. And as you can see, we get a little welcome screen that gives us the option to install Fedora, or we can click Not Now and just explore around a bit. But for now, let's go ahead and install Fedora. So we click Install Fedora, and then we get this install screen. So the first thing that any and every distro will ask you is what language. The first column is our spoken and written language, and the second column is the keyboard layout. I'm in the US, so I'm going to pick the US. Then we get this install summary menu screen. Now for a lot of distros, there would actually be a lot more stuff on this screen for us to look through and set things up for. But since the Fedora ISO we downloaded was an everything sort of ISO, it kind of sets everything up with a bunch of default values and stuff, and it just installs all the programs that it has on it already. So we don't really have to select everything. But don't worry, you can totally go in later to change certain things if you don't like it being set to the default value. First thing I'm going to do is change the time date because I am not in Europe. I don't know why it sets me to Europe. Set me to United States. I'll set myself, we'll go with Eastern time zone. Hit done. And then we have our system. Now, this is pretty much required for every system as well when you install, and that's telling it what hard disk that you want to use for the install. And it will also ask you to choose your partitioning setup. So the only hard disk that we have is the virtual hard disk that we created for this VM, the 100 gigabyte hard drive. So we're just going to leave that alone. It's already selected. And then down here is where we set up our partition table configuration. So if you don't know what that is, a partition table is basically a table that describes how your hard drive is broken up into different sections for your operating system. For example, with Windows, there are usually 4 partitions. There's your EFI partition, there's your 2 recovery partitions, and then there's the OS partition, which is basically the operating system and all your storage files and everything like that. So with Linux, we have to create a partition table. Fortunately, we don't have to create it manually ourselves if we don't want to. That's what the automatic is for. So we're going to leave the automatic selected so that we don't have to worry about building it ourselves. And then the free up space by removing or shrinking existing partitions, that's only if like you have data on a hard drive already and you want to wipe it. But since we're using a virtual hard drive, we don't have to worry about that option. And then encrypt my data. If you want to encrypt your hard drive, you can check that box and you'll be asked to set a passphrase. But I'm going to leave that unchecked too. You can check it if you want. We're going to click Done. And then we're going to click Begin Install. This might take a while depending on how big the ISO is and what you may have selected for your install. And when it's done, we just click Finish Installation. Now that only closes out the installer. It doesn't shut down the entire VM. So we have to go up here and choose Power Off. Then, before we start the virtual machine back up, we have to go to our virtual optical drive, click on it, and choose Remove Disk from the virtual drive. We're essentially ejecting the ISO media from our virtual optical disk drive. If we don't do this, then when we start the virtual machine back up, it will just go through the live session process again. But now that we've done that, we go up here and click Start, and our virtual machine should start back up. And once it's done booting up, we'll boot up directly into a desktop screen with a setup session. And that's pretty much it. That's how you set up a Linux distro using a virtual machine. All that's left to do is to set up your user account and configure your system the way you want it. So I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it helpful, and if you did, be sure to hit the like button and leave a comment below to let me know what you think. And if you want to see more, head on over to the Wayfair Coding Academy channel to check out my other content. And while you're there, consider subscribing to the channel to stay up to date as new stuff comes out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.